Welcome. My name is Meg Honey, and I am honored to formally kick us off with this Live from the Library event with Jerry Mitchell. Before we get started, I want to extend a special thanks to our live program sponsors, Friends of the Walnut Creek Library, Minutemen Press, Lafayette, and the East Bay Times. Our libraries are free, but programs and resources are not. The Walnut Creek Library Foundation supports both this library and the Ignacio Valley Library branch with programs for adults, teens, and children, along with all of the materials for these programs. Tonight, after the presentation, we will have buckets outside, and if you have some spare change or a few dollars and you enjoy our programs, I hope that you will make a small donation. Tonight, all of the bucket money received will be matched by 2 Walnut Creek Library Foundation board members, the amazing Gail Vassar, who's back there. Gail, you want to wave? Thank you, Gail. And my very own mom, Carol Weinstra, back there too. So remember, whatever you donate will be doubled. So dig in and donate often. Finally, just a reminder to turn off your cell phones at this time. Tonight, we are very excited to have investigative journalist Jerry Mitchell talk about his work and his book, Race Against Time, A Reporter Reopens the Unsolved Murder Cases of the Civil Rights Era, a compelling account of how he brought Ku Klux Klansmen to justice decades after they thought they got away with murder. The book was just released last month, and it was named one of Newsweek's most anticipated books of 2020. Mr. Mitchell's book has been glowingly reviewed by the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal, and was also recommended by Oprah Winfrey in her latest edition of O Magazine. Based in Mississippi since 1986, Mitchell has worked for more than 30 years reopening the cold cases of the civil rights era. His pursuit of those responsible for some of the most notorious murders of the period has led to the conviction of several Klansmen, as well as the production of in-depth reports examining issues of racism, bribery, and the legal system in the American South. Winner of more than 30 national awards, Mitchell is a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient and a Pulitzer Prize finalist. He is also the founder of the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting, a nonprofit that continues his work of exposing injustices and raising a new generation of investigative reporters. On a personal note, I had the honor of meeting Jerry many years ago when I took my students to Mississippi as part of the Sojourn to the Past Civil Rights Movement learning experience. I was captivated by his story and so appreciated how he took time every year to meet with large groups of young people and share his experience as a journalist and as a tireless agent for justice. So many of my students, year after year, shared that meeting Jerry was a vital and formative moment for them, and I am so excited to welcome him to our community. Please help me welcome to our stage my friend Jerry Mitchell.
Well, it's great to be here. Even got some folks here from Mississippi, so, you know. My buddy Gene, his wife. Great for y'all to be here. So anyway, this is the cover of my book, Race Against Time. It's a photograph, as far as I know, has never been published. It's a photograph that the FBI took. It's from the FBI files of the station wagon that the 3 civil rights workers were driving. This is a picture of them, pictures of them. This was the FBI reward poster that was circulated by the FBI. James Chaney, well, I'll do them in order. Andy Goodman, James Chaney, Mickey Schwerner disappeared. You know, as far as everyone knew, they were killed by the Klan, but they disappeared. No one knew where they went to. June 21st, 1964, their bodies weren't found until 44 days later. The Klan had killed them and buried their bodies 15 feet down in an earthen dam. And so this was the FBI reward poster that circulated. Not too long ago, just a few years ago, I went and visited James Chaney's grave. And he's from Meridian, Mississippi, and just south of town is a cemetery where he's buried. The headstone there has been vandalized so many times that they actually had to put steel posts up to keep it from being vandalized. But on the face of his grave, it actually has a quote, and it says, "There are those who are alive yet will never live, those who are dead yet will live forever. Great deeds inspire and encourage the living." And so I want to kind of talk about some of those whose great deeds inspire us, including this man. His name is Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was fought in World War II, fought in Normandy, and came home after fighting the Nazis to fight racism all over again in the form of Jim Crow that barred African Americans from restaurants, restrooms, voting booths. Medgar Evers became the first field secretary for the Mississippi NAACP. He actually had an Oldsmobile, and the reason he had like an Oldsmobile with the most powerful engine, 440 horsepower or something like that, and the reason he had it was to outrun the Klansmen at night across the Mississippi Delta. Anyway, he put, like I said, 40,000 miles. He would investigate, killings, violence, other violence, help build up NAACP branches across the state of Mississippi. On the same night that President Kennedy told the nation that the grandsons of slaves were still not free, Medgar Evers was shot in the back of his own driveway in Jackson, Mississippi, and his wife and children ran outside, saw the blood, screamed, and he died an hour later. That was June 12th, 1963. I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. Anybody else that way? Am I the only one? A few folks here will confess it's true. But Mississippi had something called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, which was a state segregation spy agency. And they spied on more than 10,000 people, collected spy files, and they actually, all their documents together totaled more than 132,000 pages. So the Mississippi legislature, in finally doing away with this agency, decided to seal all those records for 50 years. So my first thought when I found out they were sealed for 50 years, knowing the Mississippi legislature, I thought, well, there must be something in there, right? They wouldn't be sealing for 50 years. So I began to develop sources that had access to the files, began to leak me the files. And what they showed was at the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. LeBeckwith for the killing of Medgar Evers, this other arm of the state, the Sovereignty Commission, was secretly assisting defense trying to get Beckwith acquitted, and nobody knew that. My story ran October the 1st, 1989. At the time my story ran, the odds were literally more than 1,000,000 to 1 against the case ever being reopened and re-prosecuted. There was no murder weapon, no transcript, nothing in the court files of any kind of value. But Merle Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, believed, and she prayed, and some amazing things happened. A couple months later, Jackson police are cleaning out a closet, having to find a box that contained a crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including the fingerprint of Byron D. LeBeckwith lifted from the murder weapon. A few months after that, Merle Evers shared with me her copy of the court transcript that she had saved in a safety deposit box. And a few months after that, the prosecutor in the case found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet, which sounds like I'm making it up. This is why I like nonfiction. Anyway. And so I went to interview Byron D. LeBeckwith in April of 1990. You can probably guess how I found his house. And so anyway, I had to pass a quiz to come. It was like, where were you born? Where did you grow up? What are your parents' names? Where do you go to church? Where do you live? And I could have refused really to answer those questions, but I knew he would like them, so I just answered honestly. And so he invited me up, and I went up and talked to him. I spent about 6 hours talking to Byron D. LeBeckwith. absolutely the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. I mean, N-word this, N-word that. Then he started in on other non-white races, and then he was very anti-Semitic as well. He was a part of what's called Christian identity. Who all knows what Christian identity is? We got a few folks maybe that know Christian. All right, here's a crash course. I apologize in advance for how racist this is, okay? But this is what they actually believe. They believe that Adam and Eve were white people. Yeah, right. And they believe that that all the non-white races were created on the sixth day with the animals and therefore have no souls. And they believe that Eve had sex with Satan the serpent, and that's where Jews came from. And this is like horribly anti-Semitic, horribly racist. But that's what they actually believe. He believed that. He told me all about it. And so, you know, have you ever talked to someone when you got done, you felt like you needed to have a bath? That was the way I felt. And so it was starting to get dark, and I thought it would be a good time to go. And he insisted on like walking me out to the car, and I'm like, really? That's okay, you know. I think I can find my way. So he walks me out to the car anyway, gets me out there, says, if you write positive things about white Caucasian Christians, God will bless you. If you write negative things about white Caucasian Christians, God will punish you. If God does not punish you directly, several individuals will do it for him. And so his wife and made me a sandwich. I think you can guess what I did with the sandwich. So Byron D. Beckwith was indicted for the murder of Medgar Evers in December of 1990. When I went and talked to him, he had no idea that I was the one that wrote the story that got the case reopened. You know, remember, this is pre-internet. And not that he would have been on it probably anyway, but he didn't put two and two together. By the time he got extradited back to Mississippi, he kind of figured it out. And so he saw me across the courtroom and he goes, you see that boy over there? When he dies, he's going to Africa. So I turned to a friend of mine and went, you know, I've always wanted to go to Africa. So Byron D. Beckwith was convicted on February 5th, 1994, in the exact same courtroom he'd been tried in almost 30 years ago to the day. And when the word guilty rang out, you could hear the waves of joy as they cascaded down the hall until it reached a foyer full of people, black and white, just erupted in cheers. And I just felt chills. And Myrlie Evers and her daughter, Rena, cheered as well. And I just felt chills because the impossible had suddenly become possible. Not too long after Byron D. Beckwith was indicted, I met with this woman. Her name is Ellie Damer. Ellie Damer, his husband was killed by the Klan. His name was Vernon Damer. He was a farmer, businessman, entrepreneur, dedicated to voting rights. He believed that once all Americans got the right to vote, that this nation, Mississippi and the nation, would begin to change. And so the Klan didn't like that, attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, January 10th, 1966, set their house on fire, began firing their guns into the house. Vernon Damer woke up, grabbed his shotgun, ran to the front of the house, began firing back at the Klansmen so that his family could escape safely out a back window. Unfortunately, the flames of the fire seared his lungs, and he died later that day. A few weeks later in the mail came his voter registration card. He fought his whole life for the right of all Americans to be able to vote, but never been able to cast a ballot himself. One of the interesting, for those, there are actually some here who've actually met the Vernon Damer family, and you can ask them about it. They're just one of the finest families you will ever meet in your life. Incredible family. But Vernon Damer had 7 sons, 6 of whom served a total of 78 years in our armed forces. 4 of them were in the military at the time of the attack, defending our country as far away as Germany. And when they got home, this is what they found. To me, it's one of the most horrific and moving photographs of the civil rights era This photograph was taken by Chris McNair. And you may not know who that is, but Chris McNair is the father of Denise McNair. And Denise McNair is one of the 4 little girls that was killed in the Birmingham church bombing in 1963. The guy who ordered this was this guy. His name is Sam Bauer. Sam Bauer was the head of the White Knights at KKK in Mississippi, responsible for at least 10 killings that we know of, probably more. Bauer's never been convicted in the case. And so after the Vernon Dahmer family met with me, they met with the district attorney's office, and he reopened the case. But he pretty quickly got cold feet. He didn't stay. He kept having excuses. I don't have an investigator, and then I wrote about it, and the legislature gave him an investigator. Well, I don't have the FBI files. I wrote about that, and the FBI turned over their files, and he still couldn't do it, And so that DA ended up leaving office. Another district attorney came in, and who seemed to care even less about the case. So it looked like nothing was going to happen. I got this opportunity to go to Ohio State and get my master's, and they were going to let me. Tuition was free, and I get paid for it, etc. So I went to Ohio, and I'm literally in Ohio in the spring of 1997 when I get a telephone call from a guy who wouldn't identify himself, but said he had information about the Dahmer case. So I flew back to Mississippi. I met with him, and there were 2 sons of Vernon Dahmer. They were there, a bunch of us there, and it turned out this guy was a recovering gambling addict. And one of the 12 steps is to make amends for the bad stuff you've done in the past. He worked for Sam Bowers. He was a kid at the time, and he overheard Sam Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Dahmer. So after he met with us, then he met with the district attorney's office. The case got reopened in earnest. The guy who had been the key witness back in the 1960s was this guy. His name is Billy Roy Pitts. Billy Roy Pitts was involved in the killing of Vernon Dahmer, dropped his gun, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, got a life sentence for that, pleaded guilty to federal charges, and got 5 years for that. So I was just trying to research a lot of these guys there weren't that many. There was just a handful that got convicted, and the ones that did, it was a bit of a joke. I mean, it's like one of them, the governor pardoned him, and another one, the governor commuted his sentence, and another one, got released on work release. You get the picture. It was horrible and a joke. So Billy Roy Pitts, I couldn't find a record of his state time, but what I'd been told was he went into the Federal Witness Protection Program. And then, so I was talking to the Federal Bureau of Prisons because I was curious how much actual time he did behind bars in federal prison. He had a 5-year sentence. So I'm talking to this archivist who's up in Washington, D.C., the Bureau of Prisons, and she pulls his file, and I'm saying, now, how long did he actually serve in prison? She said 3.5 years. I said, now I understand he left federal prison and went into the Witness Protection Program, and she said, well, that's impossible. So what are you talking about? It's like, there was no federal witness protection program back then. So Billy Roy Pitts had never served a single day of his life sentence in Mississippi. You don't hear about that one every day, do you? Welcome, Mississippi. So anyway, Pitts, so I didn't know if Pitts was alive, if he was dead, where he was. So I got on it was relatively early days of the internet, but I knew a website you could go on and kind of type in a name and take your chances, in terms of trying to find somebody. So I did, and up it popped. Billy Roy Pitts had his address, Denham Springs, Louisiana, his telephone number. So I called him. First 20 minutes of the conversation went like this. How'd you find me? How'd you find me? I'm like, it's on the internet. The internet, I've got a listed telephone number. I'm like, I guess you have to take it up with them. So a result of my story that he had never served a single day of his life sentence, Mississippi authorities issued a warrant for his arrest. He didn't like that. In fact, he ran. And while he was on the run, he sent me this audio cassette. And when I got it, I played it. And this is how it began, literally. Jerry, I just thought I'd let you know you've ruined my life. But I promise if I talk to anybody, I talk to you. So here's this tape. And on his tape, he proceeds to tell me all about his involvement in killing Vernon Dahmer, all about his involvement also the Klan violence. So shortly after this, he turns himself into authorities. And this now leads to the arrest of Sam Bowers. This is now May of 1998. In addition to Sam Bowers, was also arrested his right-hand guy. His name was Devers Nix. And Devers was the head of, and I swear I'm not making this up, the Klan Bureau of Investigation. So when the family brought Devers Nix in, it was like the most pitiful sight you've ever seen. They like wheeled him in the wheelchair with the oxygen tank, and they wheeled him up in front of the judge, and he's like, I can't take more than a couple steps without needing oxygen, Judge. And the judge is like, well, I normally don't do this, but I'm going to let you out without bond. A dozen days later, this is like a reporter's dream. This is where we caught him. So he got arrested. Yeah, he loved me. So fast forward now, Sam Bowers goes on trial, and guess who's there to testify on his behalf but Devers Nix. And this is kind of tricky because he's charged with the same crime. And he was, by the way, which cracked me up, wearing the same golf cap. But anyway, so he's getting ready to get up and testify. Now, Devers Nix was represented by this really good criminal defense lawyer back in the 1960s. But by now, this guy's in his 80s, and that's great. But the other detail you should know is they actually brought him from the nursing home to the courtroom. And so he's trying to work out, you know about your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, and his lawyer's just trying to work out a signaling system, because they're, And so he gets up there. So he's talking to Devers Nix before he gets up and says, now, Devers, if you need to take the fifth, I'm going to raise my hand. Devers like, okay. So Devers gets on the witness stand. He starts testifying. I looked over his lawyer about 5 minutes later. You know what his lawyer was doing? So Devers kept right on testifying, right? Yeah, I was in the Klan, But he tried to put a positive spin on it like there is one. Well, the Klan was a benevolent organization, passing out fruit baskets to the needy at Christmas. And under cross-examination, the prosecutor got up and said, Mr. Nix, just how many fruit baskets did you pass out? And Devers says, oh, sad to say, none. I swear it was the funniest trial I ever covered in my entire life as a reporter. Deadly serious matter, but funny trial. So Bowers was represented by this guy on the right. His name is Travis Buckley. Okay. So Travis Buckley represented a lot of these Klan guys I'm talking about. Byron D. Beckwith, and I'll be talking about in a minute, Edgar Ray Killen. He represented a lot of these Klan guys. So he was a lawyer for the Klan. But the other thing you should know is he was also a leader in the Klan. You got that? He was actually indicted for the Vernon Dahmer firebombing. And so the prosecution is kind of laying out their case. There was a planning meeting that took place prior to the attack on Vernon Dahmer and his family, and they're kind of, talking about that. And the prosecutor's like, who all was at this meeting? And Pitts is like, I was there. Sam Bowers was there. Devers Nix was there. Travis Buckley was there. And so no reaction from Travis Buckley, which I just couldn't believe, right? And then the court reporter is like, now what were those names again? So that's Billy Roy Pitts, Sam Bowers, Devers Nix, Travis Buckley. By now, Buckley woke up and got up. Objection, Your Honor. I've covered a lot of trials in my life as a reporter. I have to tell you, that's the only trial I ever covered where a witness implicated the defense lawyer himself in the case. So Sam Bowers was convicted of the murder of Vernon Dahmer on August 21st, 1998, and sentenced to life in prison, just like Byron D. Beckwith. I mentioned this briefly a while ago. The next case I got involved with, to be honest, kind of accidentally, in the sense of I was just writing about what other cases were being looked at by authorities, and this was it, one of them, the Birmingham church bombing, September 15th, 1963. You've seen the footage of, the dogs and the fire hoses and all that kind of stuff. The thing you should know is the Children's Crusade started from the 16th Street Baptist Church. That's where they marched out of, and this was the church that was bombed. So it wasn't an accident. It was this particular church, and of course, these 4 beautiful girls were killed, and a 5th girl was blinded, Sarah Collins. And one of the last living suspects is this guy. His name is Bobby Cherry. So I talked to him while I was doing these kind of overview stories of what other cases were being looked at. I talked to him briefly. Months later, his wife emailed me and said, Bobby wants to talk to you. I'm like, okay. And he lived near Tyler, Texas, which wasn't too far from where I grew up, which is the schizophrenic town of Texarkana. So I knew where he lived. So I drove from Mississippi over to Texas, took him and his wife out for barbecue, because I guess that's what you take Klansmen out for. I'm not really sure. But we ate barbecue, and he's like, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling. Even pulled out a sworn statement from this woman that was supposedly there too. Yes, I remember that night while we're all sitting around watching wrestling. So I got back to the Clarion-Ledger newsroom the next day and talked to our librarian, Susan Garcia, and just said, Susan, just check and see what was on Birmingham, with the Birmingham News, and see what was on TV that night. And, those of you who are my age or older, I'm sure you remember when they used to run the entire television schedule in a very small box in the newspaper, because there were only, 2 or 3 channels or whatever there were. So the next day, Susan said to me, there was no wrestling. So Bobby Cherry got arrested. I'd heard he had something to do also with the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. Fred Shuttlesworth was one of the bravest people in the civil rights movement. He was beaten. His church was blown up. His house was blown up. I mean, can you imagine this? You're home on Christmas Day, and the Klan bombs your house, and he somehow miraculously survived. And then he was beaten when he tried to enroll his 2 daughters at an all-white Birmingham school in 1957. And I'd heard he had something to do, that Bobby Cherry was involved in that. He wouldn't admit it when I talked to him. So anyway, fast forward, one day I get in the mail this big, thick biography on Fred Shuttlesworth. Publishers started sending me books on the civil rights movement, which was cool. And so I get this big, thick biography on Fred Shuttlesworth. I don't know if you're like me, but when I first get a big, thick book, first thing I do, look at the pictures. So I'm flipping through, I'm looking at the pictures, and there's a picture of the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth. I'm like, oh, is Bobby Cherry in there? I'm looking for Bobby Cherry now. The problem was it was a real distant shot. I really couldn't make out anybody, really. And so I called the author and said, hey, are there any other pictures of the beating of Fred Shuttlesworth? He said, oh, there's footage of it. I'm like, you're kidding. So he pointed me to this old CBS documentary. It's called Who Speaks for Birmingham, that was made years ago. And so I got a copy of it, and was able to play it. This is still back when there were VHS tapes, so it was actually a VHS tape. And anyway, my problem was I had no idea what Bobby Cherry looked like in 1957. But his son was a truck driver, kind of semi-estranged from Dad, and I was able to reach out to, his name was Tom. I reached out to him. He'd come through Mississippi once in a while, and I called him up and said, hey, Tom, would you mind coming by and looking at this? Yeah, sure. So he came by. This is just a frame of it. Rather than play the whole tape. It's kind of hard to see except in really, really slow motion. But anyway, But this is a frame of it. This is Fred Shuttlesworth all the way over to the left, and that's his wife, who was also stabbed. And that one of their daughters had her ankle broken, I believe, so by this attack. But anyway, so I showed this to Tom, and he's like, "Yep, there's Dad." And he even pointed out something I didn't see. It's the guy all the way on the right with the white shirt and the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. That's Bobby Cherry. He's like, "Yep, there's Dad." And he even pointed out something I didn't see. He says, "Yeah, you see him reaching in his right front pocket? That's where he kept his brass knuckles." And sure enough, you can see him in the footage just waylay Fred Shuttlesworth. And Fred Shuttlesworth got a concussion from that. So when Bobby Cherry went on trial, they showed this footage of him beating Fred Shuttlesworth. And they introduced the television logs that showed there was no wrestling. And Bobby Cherry was convicted and sentenced to 4 life sentences, 1 for each one of those girls, in 2002. Remember what I told you before? If someone tells me I can't have something I want like a million times worse. Well, Sam Bauer's never talked to the press. Ever, ever, ever. Well, I found out he did an interview with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, but it was sealed. So you can probably guess what I did. I got somebody to leak it to me. And so Bowers talked about what we talked about earlier, the Mississippi burning case, the 3 civil rights workers that were killed by the Klan. And so there was a federal trial. There was never a murder trial, but there was a federal trial on conspiracy charges, conspiracy to deprive of their civil rights. So Bowers was one of 7 Klansmen convicted in this case. The rest of the 18 Klansmen just walked. And so Bowers was talking about that case in this interview, and he said he was quite delighted to be convicted and have the main instigator of the entire affair walk out of the courtroom a free man. And he was referring to this guy, Edgar A. Killen, or as he's known locally, Preacher Killen. So I called Preacher Killen up. We talked for a long time. Finally, at some point, Preacher Killen said, "There's some guy in Jackson just keeps stirring things up and stirring things up and stirring things up." And I just didn't have the heart to tell him it was me. So I took him and his wife out for catfish. I like feeding them Klansmen. So we went out and ate catfish. I normally don't tell this part, but I think it's in the book. I can't remember. I get confused sometimes, but this is one of my favorite little details, like tiny details about the dinner that night. It was one of these, and those of you who are from the South will know what I'm talking about. But they have these like all you can eat catfish places, and they're like all you like catfish and hush puppies and the usual things that they have with that. And so this was like one of those $8.95 all you can eat places, including sweet tea. You know what I mean? It was one of those places. And so literally they served whole catfish. I mean, this is one of the only places I ever went that served whole catfish. And he finished off 3 of those. And the little waitress comes around and goes, "Would you like a piece of pie, Preacher Killen?" And he goes, "No, I think I'll have another catfish." I don't know why that cracks me up so much, but I think it's so funny. But anyway, but we went out to eat. Seriously, I'll get serious. We went out to eat, and he just, anyway, I asked him if he had anything to do with the killings of the three young men. He said no. And I said, "Well, what do you think should happen to people that were responsible for killing these 3 young men?" And he said, "I'm not going to say they were wrong." And then he proceeds to tell me this story about himself. When Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis in 1968, at that moment in time, the FBI had no idea who did it. So they kind of sent out agents to talk to the usual suspects, including Preacher Killen. Wanted to know his whereabouts on April 4th, 1968. He refused to talk to him. But one of the agents left his card. So time goes on. One day, Preacher Killen picks up the card, calls the agent, wants to know who killed King. Agent's like, why do you want to know? And Killen says, man, I want to shake his hand. You know, sometimes people will see, you know, Preacher Killen or these older men, they'll be going to trial or they'll be going off to prison, and they'll say to me, Jerry, why don't you leave these old men alone? And you know what I tell them? These were young killers. They just happen to get old. Edgar Ray Killen was convicted on the exact anniversary of these killings, 41 years later, June 21st, in 2005. And this is what he orchestrated. Their bodies, as I mentioned before, were found 44 days later. James Chaney, 3 young men, James Chaney, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner. The unfortunate part is the hate that caused this has never really gone away in this country or around the world, really. 5 years ago, a young man walked in this church in Charleston and killed these 9 beautiful people. Here's how it connects. Because you think history, what does it matter? This history we've been talking about, what does it matter? It connects. History informs our present and our future. Dylan Roof, before he went and killed these people at the church, you know what website he was looking at? Council of Conservative Citizens. And you may think, well, what does that matter? They are a direct descendant of the White Citizens Council in Mississippi. In fact, Byron D. LeBeckwith, while I was talking to him, praised them for doing the council's work, what the White Citizens Council have been doing. So these things do matter. A couple of years ago in Pittsburgh, I'm sure you remember this, a man walked in the synagogue and killed 11 people in that congregation. And he said he was trying to destroy the Jews. And then just a year ago in El Paso, 22 people were killed. And the language that the man used, and of course injured dozens of others, the language the man used is interesting. And he drove all the way from Dallas to El Paso, which is a pretty good drive. He said he was trying to protect this country from an invasion. That is exact language that the Ku Klux Klan used in Mississippi in 1964, before the college students came in as part of Freedom Summer. Exact same language. Before people hate, they fear. And when people fear, they begin to dehumanize. Or as they give themselves permission to destroy people, right? If they're less than human, well, I'm not killing a human. Or if they're a monster, well, I'm doing society a favor, right? And that's, our language matters immensely, what we say, because it's paving the way for this kind of hate and violence, unfortunately. People have asked me about my own journey, and I did get death threats, probably dozens of death threats, and Klansman said he was going to slit my throat. He called a lot of times, and he seemed to be fond of calling me for whatever reason and threatening me, and as well as other people I worked with. And then another Klansman said he had pictures of me and knew where I lived. And the FBI actually investigated both those cases, and it was disconcerting, but it led to an unexpected gift, and that is the gift of living fearlessly. Living fearlessly is not about living without fear. It's about living beyond fear. It's about living for something greater than ourselves. Isn't that what we see in the movement? And I know a lot of people in the Bay Area were involved in the movement, both here and going south and taking part in the movement around this country, or supporting it in some way. But that's what you see with John Lewis, with Dr. King, with so many others. There's so many local people that really haven't gotten credit for their involvement in the movement, and they do deserve credit, and they are really some of our true heroes. And I would like to see more recognition of the local people, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things. To date now, there have been 24 convictions in these murders, and it's a matter of faith with me. Yeah, that's a good thing to clap about. It's a matter of faith with me, but I believe God's hand has been involved in these cases. But the most amazing thing I've witnessed has actually not been the convictions. It's been some of the racial reconciliation. Not too long after Sam Bowers was convicted, Billy Roy Pitts testified in a hearing, and when he got done, he walked to the back of the courtroom, and he ran into Mrs. Damer. And Billy Roy Pitts apologized to Mrs. Damer and asked her to forgive him for killing her husband. And she forgave him. And she began to cry. He began to cry. And as I walked out of the courtroom that day, I thought about that quote on James Chaney's grave. There are those who are alive, yet will never live. Those who are dead, yet will live forever. And in that moment, it dawned on me, each day we are etching the words of our headstones. What do you want your headstone to say? May God bless you in your journey. Thank you so much. Yeah.
We are going to get into some questions, but I guess since I have the microphone, I can start with my own question.
Sure.
First, Jerry, thank you so much for sharing with us. And we will definitely get to what's on the screen too. But I do want to start with the late Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist David Halberstam. And he once called your work, quote, a reflection of what a reporter with a conscience can do. Your book, Race Against Time, has been described as a remarkable journalistic detective story and a vital piece of American history. With all of that being said, who should read your book and why?
Yeah, everybody should read my book. I think I think the best way to explain my book is to kind of talk about the levels or different aspects of the book. At its most basic level, it's a detective story. So if people like true crime, if they like detective stories, that's really what it is. In terms of structure and how it's told. And at another level, it's a story of these incredibly courageous families, and those of you who have met some of these families, you know what I'm talking about. The Evers family, the Damer family, the families of the 4 girls, the 3 civil rights workers and their families. I always say that's the biggest reward I've gotten, is getting to know these families. So it tells that story, and also the authorities that decided to pursue this case. I mean, I have no authority to pursue any case. I have to... either they get convinced to do it and they believe they should do it, or I try my best to embarrass them into into doing it. So it's kind of that story as well. And then kind of also in there, this is my secret takeaway from the book, is it tells the history of this country with regard to race. And it's embedded. It's not meant to be a history book, but it's meant to at least give people enough information. It's amazing to me how many people so far have read the book and said, white and black, have said, I never knew all that happened. Including someone the other day that interviewed me, and they worked in the civil rights movement. And they said, I thought I knew these stories. And so I just think it's a history that I think everybody should read. And I think the other thing is, I think especially for students, I wrote it simply. It's a very, on one level, it's a very easy read. I didn't, I'm a journalist. I'm not as fond of the $10 words. I like the I like the simple words. But on, hopefully, so students can understand it easily. And I'm hopeful that it can be used in that way, that teachers or others can use the book in the classroom, because, and I know if you hand a kid a history book, they're going to go, oh, no. But if you hand them a detective story, then maybe they'll get caught up in it and read it. And that's my hope. That's my secret hope, is that people will begin to learn this history. Not that this is the end of hopefully that journey, but maybe it can jumpstart a journey for them into learning this history. So, I know it's a long answer to your question.
No, that's great. And I don't know, Jerry, if you can put up your slide with all of your contact information.
Yeah, I'll
wanted
put it
to
up
ask
now.
one other question, and we will definitely get to your nonprofit. You do a lot of work via social media, as you were talking about history, of really continuing to educate the people that are following you. Can you talk a little bit about how you utilize social media to do that?
Sure.
And how your history has been received?
Yeah. It's and so you can follow me on Facebook or Twitter, and that's my email. And the bottom website is my nonprofit. We will talk about it in a minute. But every day I post kind of this day in civil rights history. So if you're interested in that history, it's a way you can kind of begin to learn. And the response from people, both white and black, has been kind of fascinating. I'll have people say, I never knew this, or why didn't they teach me this in school, or and so it's very fascinating. And then the other thing that's kind of fascinating is sometimes the people that are on part of my page will respond to it. They'll say, that's my grandfather, or or I was there in the church that day when it blew up, and different things like that. So it's always fascinating. I mean, and you're kind enough to get on that page as well. It's fascinating to see the reactions from people every day. Almost, every day there's usually some kind of interesting discussion connected to it, which is these days seems kind of unusual for social media, having actually an interesting, intelligent discussion. So.
And with your website there, can you tell us a little bit about the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting, which is the nonprofit you started?
Yeah, this is a nonprofit I started January a year ago, and we are working on some cold cases, but we're also looking at injustices, other things, as we say, shining a light, exposing darkness. I just kind of view that as kind of our goal. We started reporting on prisons in January of last year in Mississippi, and basically warned that they were going to blow up, and they did blow up, and Justice Department is now investigating, because of our reports mainly. And so, we don't like bad things to happen, but that's what we're trying to do, is to get the public officials engaged to try to do something about it. But yeah, we've written about mental health, public school funding or lack of funding. For example, I was curious how much black schools were underfunded in Mississippi compared to white schools between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era, when schools started to be desegregated. And the figure that I was able to come up with, which I couldn't find it anywhere, was in modern dollars, $25 billion. And I just wonder what that figure is nationally. You know what I mean? What is that figure nationally? Are we talking trillions of dollars? And what effect does that have when you have generation after generation after generation that are deprived of education? Anyway. So yeah, I think we're doing important work. And if you know any rich folks that want to give us money, let me know. Yeah. Anyway, that's it.
We can open up for questions for Jerry. Yes.
You give them the mic.
I have a big mouth. So. Do you correspond with the Southern Poverty Center? You do.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I know the folks over there. The stuff that I've done on these cases. I mean, they put out a publication way back when they have the 40 martyrs on this marker. Essentially, it's incredibly well done. If you ever go to Montgomery, you know what I'm talking about. It has the water that runs over the names, but they put out a publication called Free at Last, that I actually got a copy of back then, 89 or 90, something like that. And I thought it did a pretty good job of kind of summing up these cases. It became a good reference work for me. And then with regard to prisons, they've been involved in some of the prison litigation. So I've certainly been having conversations with them about that as well. Yeah.
Yes.
I have kind of two. One is
Yeah, hand them the mic. That'll make it a lot easier.
kind of two. One is, is there sort of a white whale that you're chasing, one case that you really would like to pursue? And the second part is some of us are feeling a little fatigued about how much progress we're not making. And maybe you have some stories of hope or
Sure.
lights you want to shine on or actions we could take or something like
Yeah. I'll try to tackle one at a time. The first one was
White whale.
White whale. Do I have a white whale? Wow. Well, I think, prisons right now are what I'm kind of really focused on. I would just want to make sure that the authorities, yes, the Justice Department is investigating, but that doesn't mean change happens, and so I'm trying to make sure, for example, I'll give a quick example. This is a story, I can't remember I don't know if it's posted yet. It'll be posted, pretty soon. But that I wrote, which is basically the new Mississippi Corrections Commissioner isn't required to have any corrections experience. Now, this is a really good idea after we've just had the worst prison crisis in decades that we did a story on that. And so those are the kind of things we just want to be able to continue to point these things out. In terms of stories of hope, what we have seen, and obviously I'm coming out from being an investigative reporter, what I've seen over and over again is when you do shine a light and just stay on it, you can't give up. You got to stay and persevere. Things do happen. I'll give you a simple example. In Neshoba County, Mississippi, you can't imagine. When the FBI agents came in 1964, nobody in that town talked to them. Zero. They circled the wagons. They weren't going to help the FBI out. Nobody talked at all in 1964. So I'm just giving that as a background. So this is the same Neshoba County that had the trial for Edgar Ray Killen in 2005, and he was convicted. 2 years later, the town, Philadelphia, in Neshoba County, elected its first African-American mayor. And they are 2/3 white. So it's not a majority white town, a majority black town or something. And he has continued to be reelected without opposition. So you think in some ways sometimes these things don't have an effect. But remember what Robert Kennedy says, you do these things and they do send kind of ripples out. And they do begin to have effect. That's just like with the Medgar Evers case. I had no idea, whether anything would ever happen. But you just kind of push out and you begin to work on it. And a lot of times that's when things happen. You just have to be, when I talk to young journalists, they ask me what's my advice to them. I said, never give up. And that's a good advice for all of us. Yeah.
What role, if any, has FOIA played in your investigation, and what kind of track record do you have in cooperation from the government?
Well, I'm sorry to inform you, but I'm not very good with FOIA. I'm better at developing sources to just give me the files. So, in Mississippi particularly, it's just, but the federal government, I've gotten plenty of FBI files from them, But in general, a lot of times they're redacted. In fact, something just passed within the past year. Senator Doug Jones, the one who prosecuted the Birmingham case, he authored legislation that passed that basically is going to open up these files now. Because so many of these files that if you get them through traditional means, they are redacted. They're heavily redacted and sometimes weirdly redacted, there are people that are dead, they're still redacting their names and things that they shouldn't be redacted. So there's actually a commission that's going to be put in place to try to open up as many of those records as possible, which I think is very important. It's especially important for the press because we don't have access to the files in general. But I've been very fortunate. I've actually had sources who leaked me the unredacted files. So, you know, that's kind of the way I've always operated. So, yeah.
Jerry will be out in front to
I will.
sign books, and we have the wonderful Orinda Books who are selling Race Against Time. Can we please give Jerry one more round of applause? Thank you so much.
Thank you.